Walter Evans was a devout, if not fanatic man. He spent his days mingling with churchgoers and choir members, his evenings performing missionary work or arranging charity functions, and his nights were spent praying to the good Lord above. On the outside, one might think he was the model citizen, and at one point, I would have been so inclined to agree with you on that notion. However, in the years prior, Walter never felt more like he needed proof of the afterlife. He found himself day after day wandering through the recesses of his house, milling about his daily chores. He would wake up, water the garden, make breakfast for himself and for his wife, read the paper, and watch sports as they came on the television. He was a profound watcher of the young and the restless, and he even went so far as to get me hooked one autumn afternoon when I had the day off of work. I guess I should probably mention that he was my grandfather. In the years leading up to the change, Sharon, his wife, my step-grandmother, he had remarried after his first wife left for the mailman, had begun to suffer from the onset of Alzheimer's, a horrible condition that takes its toll on the family and friends of the afflicted. In case you were wondering, no, this isn't about my step-grandmother's descent into the realm of Alzheimer-fueled insanity. No, this story isn't about her. For prior to her death, she was pleasant. I mean, sure, she was frustrated at times, but she was always pleasant nonetheless. In the months leading up to her death, and the weeks that followed, Grandpa began to change as well. It is my belief that his change was spurred on by the quintessential example of the shortness of life. In fact, it was around this time that he first picked up a Bible and began to pray. You see, oftentimes I would stop by to visit, and check on my Sharon, who by this point had forgotten my name, and offer comfort to Grandpa, who would always have his nose buried in the Bible, fervently scanning the pages in the hopes of finding an answer to one of life's greatest mysteries. As the weeks passed, he became worse. The house began to fall into disrepair, and each time I would swing by, I would find a new pile of garbage or a new stack of books piled high in the corner. They were all various interpretations of the Bible, some relatively popular and others very obscure. Still, he hadn't found what he was looking for. After my step-grandma's death, it wasn't long until he began to visit church events and partake in the charity events that brought him to a higher social status than he was before. His house began to return to its former state, and he became more sane. I thought that he had been granted peace by the presence of belief in a higher power. I was happy for him, ecstatic that he had found an outlet in which he could handle his grief, and I had been so inclined to attend one of the events with him. Grandpa drove us down the ashen concrete road and towards the church where he had been attending the past few months. It wasn't far from his house. In fact, it was walking distance. However, with his bones growing weary and his knees often giving out as of late, he opted to drive. The idea was to meet at the church and then carpool to the event. He hadn't told me any more than that. We pulled into the back of the 50s-style brick church. On the outside, it appeared to be just another building, with no lettering on the front and no grand entryway like the typical churches I went to as a child. With a click, the locks on the doors disengaged, allowing us to exit the truck and approach the door that would take us inside. We were greeted by the welcoming smiles from the geriatric members of the congregation, each one sporting pearly white dentures that made them stand out a little bit too much. I recognized them from living on my grandfather's block, and I muttered an awkward hello as I continued to follow Grandpa over to the back. While we were walking, I heard one of them say to another, "It looks like the guest is here. Now we can get started." I looked back, confused at the wording of their sentence. Now we can get started. As if they couldn't proceed with a charity event if I wasn't there. Nonetheless, I continued walking, following my grandfather further back until we got to a metal table at the back of the room. It looked strange. There was a 1-inch lip surrounding the perimeter of the table with a small hole on one end. The top of the table was bare and remarkably cleaned. It was even shined to polish. I glanced to Grandpa, and then to the congregation that was moving in around me, the old shuffling in from the edges, a gleam in their eyes as if they were children on Christmas morning, eager to open their presents. I let out a stuttery and nervous laugh. "Grandpa, what's going on?" He met my eyes, a sinister smile spreading across his old and wrinkled lips. "I have done so much for you, child. It is time you give something to me. Something only you can give. Something that will prevent me from reaching the same place as Sharon. I do not want to pass it on, don't you see? I can live on forever. Just give me that gift. Die for your grandpa, won't you?" I took one step back and then another, never taking my eyes off my grandfather as I moved. I bumped into a walker and I grimaced as loose skin and fat wrapped around my body. The owner of the walker, an old lady named Gertrude, tightened her grip, remarkably strong for a woman going on 90 years old. Her arms shook and vibrated as I fought to break free of her grip, the folds slapping my face repeatedly as she jostled. I nearly vomited. The fear brought with it a burst of adrenaline, and I found myself punching at odd angle repeatedly to try and find purchase on Gertrude's face. My hand eventually connected, and something hard hit the top of my head on its way out of her face. Dentures. I struggled free of her grasp and I turned around to see the sea of old people swarming around me, hobbling in a geriatric semicircle of Satan's sacrifice. My heart clenched with fear as I looked for a way out. I didn't want to hurt these people. Sorry, Gertrude. One simple punch could render them dead, or even worse. But unfortunately, I had no choice, and I almost instantly found myself charging at the weakest of the bunch. An old German man named Wallace. He was always known for making the best cookies on the block and having an annual summer barbecue. But the last I heard, his back was failing, and so a strong man of 30 years old. It should have been easy, right? Wrong. As I charged him, he threw his cane to the side and he squared up, ready to take on the brunt of my force. Part of my brain screamed for me to stop, but I was already going too fast. When I connected with Wallace, I felt the breath leave me as my left shoulder exploded from the impact. He only slightly grunted as he wrapped his arms around my waist and, using my own momentum, lifted me up and threw me on the ground behind me. As I lay on the floor wheezing, the others began to crowd around me. Each one smiled at me, their dentures shining under the fluorescent lights above. I looked up at them, wondering what the hell was going on, as my heart palpitated behind the ribcage where it had resided. I looked to my grandpa, who still stood by the table smiling at me, as the others began to reach down to take me. I blacked out from the pain in my shoulder, as they were securing me to the table. I awoke to the sound of a man coughing, the typical throat-clearing cough that men tend to make once they're in their late 40s, and feel like they're in a constant need of asserting their dominance within a room. At first, I thought I was at Grandma's house, until the pain began to seep into my body from my broken shoulder. I craned my neck to the side to see the room was empty, save for Wallace, who had no doubt been the one to make the coughing noise. He was wiping his mouth with a Kleenex when he looked up at me. His face grew somber as he moved the used tissue to his pocket, no doubt still expecting some use out of it later. "Sorry, kid. It wasn't meant to go down like this. Your grandpa was supposed to restrain you and then bring you in. I guess he thought you wouldn't protest and get on the table like a good little boy. We warned him. Most of ours protested too." I went to speak, but nothing came out. I wasn't able to move anything other than my head, which I realized was now stuck looking at Wallace. Is all that came out. The faintest whisper of air leaving my windpipe. My tongue unable to shape the sounds that were needed to produce actual words. Wallace stood and approached me. "I pity you, child. No one should come to this fate. Your grandfather, though, he wants to be one of us. He wants to be strong, live forever, see the world. I think he's afraid of what comes after. That's what led him to us in the first place, after all." Hush now. He raised his cane up slowly. "They'll be back for you shortly." He brought the cane down on my head and sent the world spiraling into blackness. When I awoke the next time, there was a dazzling light being shined in my eyes, rendering me blind. I couldn't feel the restraints on my wrists anymore, or on my ankles. My body, it seemed it had gone completely numb from whatever they had done to immobilize me. I was grateful for it in one sense, as I could no longer feel the grating of the bones in my left shoulder. My eyes moved with fervor around the room, searching for something, anything that could aid in my escape. My eyes settled on a fire axe positioned on the wall near the foot of the table. That most definitely would have helped, but there was one obstacle I would have to overcome to get to it. My grandfather, who was standing at the foot of the table, blade in hand. He smiled at me and winked, and then he plunged the blade hilt deep into my calf. Of course, with my body still numb, I couldn't feel anything. However, I could hear the blade slide off the bone and go through to the other side, clanging off the table below. I am unsure of the amount of time that I was there. Minutes, hours. The time blurred together as Grandpa worked on my legs, slicing inch by inch away with the blade he wielded so fluently. I drifted in and out of consciousness multiple times as he chipped away at my flesh, a reaction caused dually by the anesthetic and the blood loss. Sometimes I would wake up to the smell of burning flesh as he cauterized the wounds, a tactic to keep me alive longer than necessary, I'm sure. Was I tortured? Yes, under normal circumstances, that's something you could say. However, I didn't feel any of the pain, so surely any torturing done to me was negated. It wasn't until much later, when he finally went above my knee, that I felt any pain at all. By that point, I'm sure I wasn't lucid enough to even register it, but I did. The sudden burst of pain fired pulses of fire along my nervous system. I wanted to scream and shout, but I knew that I must contain myself and find a way to escape the situation I found myself in. A sickening squelching noise came from my leg as Grandpa pulled the bones out of the socket, and I felt the nausea and fear boil in my throat as I realized what he was doing. He pulled the other free a few moments later, and this time I felt everything. the pressure building up and growing to an almost insurmountable level before the connective tissue finally gave way and my bone came free. I nearly puked right there. I felt tears well up in my eyes. I began to slowly move my hand in an almost rhythmic motion against the scrap that was binding my wrist. I had to escape. The pain was growing as my body regained motor functions. Grandpa started whistling as he began to work on my knees. The added sound allowed me the time to work on getting my wrist out of the bind. I knew that I had to do something, but I feared what the only way to get my hand out was. With a surge of strength, I tugged my hand with all my might, dislocating 3 fingers in the process. It was enough though when I pulled my hand free of the restraint with a cry, meeting Grandpa's bewildered eyes with my own. I brought my own free hand down, thwacking him over the head with it, causing the old man to stumble. He crashed into his tray of instruments, tubes and other medical equipment. I looked down at my legs for the first time. They were grossly mutilated. Strips of flesh lay semi-connected. Burned chunks of flesh had been peeled off and placed in a bucket on the ground next to the table. I turned my head and I vomited on the floor next to me, before beginning to work with my thumb and forefinger, the only 2 fingers not dislocated, to free my other hand. Grandpa stirred on the floor as I wiggled my way off the table, careful to not put too much strain on my stumps. I hadn't realized that I had rendered him unconscious in the first place. However, as he looked up at me, his face a mask of pain, he began to speak to me. His voice was pleading. "You don't understand, child. The afterlife is nothing like we expected. The master demands sacrifice to fuel his needs, and then he'll make me immortal. Don't you see? That's what we're all after." I shook my head as a tear rolled down my cheek. "Grandpa, why?" His face turned to rage, as spittle began to fly out of his mouth alongside his venom-laced words. "You have no clue what is going on. You never will. You are but cattle. Now lay the hell back down on the table and stay still, you ignorant, disregardful little shit." Fear began to bubble and broil within me, seeking refuge in my labored breast and my quickened heartbeat. I screamed desperately as I threw myself off the table, landing painfully on my stump. I rolled in agony as blood began to spurt from the wound. Cursing myself, I grabbed one of the tubes that fell off the tray, and I began tying it fervently as Grandpa began to shamble over to me. The knot was shoddy, but the pulses of the blood slowed significantly. As fear overwhelmed me, I began to crawl away from him, my body feeling lighter in the absence of calves. Adrenaline-fueled movement spurred me onward, the fear of being recaptured lingering in my mind as I reached the foot of the stairs. I began climbing them, a futile effort in the event that my arms were now screaming with pain. But nonetheless, I persevered, my grandfather gaining ground with every moment. The dusty stairs gripped my now sweaty hands, each step adding to the carpet of grime accumulating on my palms. Occasional pebbles bit into my flesh, but I had barely noticed them due to the pain, not only in my legs, but building in my arms as well. With one final desperate effort, I threw myself over the last step and I rolled onto my back, heaving with exhaustion. I didn't notice him at first, standing idly by the door we had entered from. He was just a silhouette to me, but I could make out his musculature. He began moving, not towards me but to the stairwell that I had just emerged from. As he approached, I glanced over to it, seeing the desperate face of my grandpa as he still struggled to get over to me. He froze when he saw the man striding towards him. A deep and booming voice emanated from the man. "You have failed me for the last time, Walter. It's time I bid you and this measly congregation you put together farewell. The adrenaline faded and the effects of my blood loss took hold. Yet as the edges of my vision faded to black and my thoughts began to blur, I saw the shadow-veiled man plant one foot on the face of Walter Evans and push him back down the stairs. I awoke in a plain white hospital room. The steady whir of the IV drip machine and the heart rate monitor were oddly soothing to me. I looked around the room trying to figure out how I had ended up here. A nurse walked in shortly after. Upon some prodding, she revealed to me that I had been found lying in a parking lot outside of a crumbling abandoned old community church. The building's foundations had apparently given out and the building had collapsed. They believed that I had been injured in the event, but I somehow dragged myself out. But they couldn't explain my burns. They told me that I was lucky, but they didn't know what I had been doing in there all by myself. I don't know who the man was that seemingly came to my rescue. I don't even know whether to be grateful. The past few weeks have been trying. Getting used to life without full use of your legs is daunting, and I'll be on the waiting list for prosthetics until my wounds are fully healed. I haven't seen my grandpa since, though sometimes, as I crawl into bed, I recall the words of the nurse, wondering why I had been in the building by myself, and I wonder about what happened when my consciousness eluded me, what my grandpa's end goal was, and who the master he mentioned was. Most nights, though, I find myself lying awake wondering what future awaited me had I not escaped.